Okay, this is the bubbles project. There's three key concerns here. One is that these bubbles are all loaded into the array, and they're loaded with a for loop, and they're run with a for loop running the array. So we're going to talk about how to do that. The other thing is that they have this special function that every time two bubbles overlap with each other, they change color. And so we're going to add a function inside our bubble constructor function called isOverlapping. Okay, so I've got my program laid out here in sort of two parts. On the left side, I've got my sketch, which has the setup function and the draw function. And I'm going to create a method called loadBubbles. So I haven't got any bubbles, but notice on line 7, I have declared an array. And I've declared an array named bubbles. Since this is declared outside of any function, it has global scope. That means it can be seen anywhere in the program. Now, inside function, I'm going to do a function call. And this is just going to be a guy called loadBubbles, and I'm going to fill an array with bubbles using a for loop. So there's my loadBubbles. I'm going to come down outside of this function. Remember, this is my draw function. Sometimes it's helpful to have a visual cue here of where these guys end. A lot of students, when they're just starting out, have a hard time matching all of their curly braces. In any case, I'm going to write a function. So I say function, I'm going to say the same name, loadBubbles, and now this function is set up so that everything in between those two curly braces is going to be where the load function exists. This is actually called a function definition, and so this is the end of loadBubbles. I suggest you guys do that so it keeps track of where your stuff is. So I'm going to go ahead and put a for loop in here, and the for loop is going to say var I equals 0, and actually for reasons I won't go into now, it's better to use the word let. And so we started off using the word var. The most recent version of JavaScript uses the word let. Now you can still use var, but let has a couple of tiny advantages that we may never talk about, but we'll go ahead and use it for now. In any case, let or var I equals 0, I is less than 500. That means I'm going to make 500 bubbles. I++ is I is equal to I plus 1. And then I set let loc. This is a vector, so I use the create vector method. I'm going to choose a random width and a random height value. I'm going to throw that into my vector, and it gets returned here, and then I pass that value every time I make a new bubble. That new bubble gets loaded into my array of bubbles. Since I goes from 0 to 499, I'll get 500 bubbles inside of this array. And in fact, we could go ahead and take a look at that, but right now I'm going to save all of that. And I'm going to come over here to my bubble, and notice that when I make a new bubble, I'm sending in a vector. I'm receiving that vector here, and so all I need to do is add that locally and say this dot loc is equal to location. Okay? And then I also need to have maybe a couple of other vectors. I could, for instance, say this dot vel is equal to, you know what, and I don't think you guys should have to watch me type all this. Okay, so I've got location, I've got a new vector, create vector. I'm just setting the value of the velocity to 0, 0, and I'll show you why in just a second. And then we have this diam is 20. To make it a little bit easier, if all the bubbles have the same diameter. And then finally we have this dot color. Okay, so remember, the only thing a constructor function has in it are properties and functions. So I'm going to add the functions in one at a time. The first function is the run function, so I'll put that right down here on line 10. And notice it says this dot run equals function, and so these are functions inside of the constructor function, this dot run, and now all I'm going to do here is have 4 function calls. And so when I'm back over here in the draw, notice this just says bubbles I. Well, bubbles I is a bubble object at location I, so it has a run function inside of it. The way you go inside of a bubble is with a dot. So on line 20 it says bubbles I, that's a bubble, dot run, and that function is right here inside of the bubble code. Okay, let's add a couple more functions. And I'll build one of these functions that you haven't seen before. I'll build it a little bit more slowly. Now, 3 of these functions you've seen before, and so I'm going to put these in just like this. Render, you guys have seen this. I'm just going ahead and saying render. I'm rendering an ellipse. It's at this dot loc dot x and this dot loc dot y, and whatever the diameter is here. So I've got an x location, a y location, and the diameter is the same, so it'll be a circle. And then update. This is the tricky part. This is the one where every single time I created my velocity vector up here, and I gave it the value 0, 0. But every time I come into update now, I'm going to go ahead and change the X location and the Y location by getting a random number. That's why it has that kind of wobbly effect. It's not shooting off the screen. It's just wobbling around near its location every time because it's moving 3 pixels vertically and horizontally every frame. And then all I have to do to add these together is use this method. So this is a bubble. I go inside of this to get its vector. I go inside the vector. There's an add method, and it takes in another vector. Okay, so it's taking the velocity of this bubble and adding it to the location of this bubble, and all add is going to do is going to add their X components together, their Y components, and that's it. And down here it says, if I get to the edge of the screen, go ahead and change the direction. Actually, that's not doing a whole lot, is it? You know, we could probably leave that off, but we'll just leave that for now. Okay. In any case, what we want to do is be able to tell when my bubbles are touching. And so I'm going to need another function here. I'm going to create a guy called this, and I'm going to call it isOverlapping. And I'm going to say that is equal to false. So I'm going to assume that when my program starts that this bubble is not overlapping, but I can check that just by creating a method. And so let's go ahead and do this. I'm going to say this dot is overlapping, and that's going to be equal to a function. And this function is going to test whether or not I'm overlapping. Well, how do I do that? Well, essentially, you've got to test this bubble against every other bubble in the program. And to do that, you just use a for loop. And so I'm going to go ahead and just throw a for loop in here. And I'm going to need a couple of variables. So I'll come down here a line, and I'll put this guy in, make sure that I have my curly brackets matched. So I can see I have my curly brackets matched for the function and for the for loop. And what I want to do is test this guy. And so I have to make sure, though, I'm going to test and see how far apart these guys are. But I only want to do this test if the bubble I'm looking at in the array. So I'm looking at this, I'm going to be looking at all the bubbles in this array. Well, I'm inside one of those bubbles. And so if I say if this does not equal, and the way you say that, you say not equal like that. If this does not equal bubbles I, so at some point this is going to be true. And so I only want to check the distance between this bubble and all the other bubbles. I don't want to check this against itself. So as long as I'm not looking at myself, that's what this line 21 does, then I want to go ahead and say I want to check the distance. So I'm going to say let d for distance is equal to, and the distance between these two, it's going to be this dot loc dot dist. There's a dist function, so I go inside of the vector. There's a dist function inside the vector class. Since loc is a vector, I go inside it with dot, this dot loc dot dist, and guess what it's going to take? It's going to take in another variable. Well, to do that, I just say bubbles, and I say which bubble I'm looking at, dot loc, and now I get a distance between those two. So that's the big idea. And now, if the distance is, well, what do we want to pay attention to here? I'm going to say if the distance, if d is less than, and I'm going to just do 2 times this dot diam. And actually the diameter, we want half the radius. So I think what I'll do is this times 2 times, let's see, 2 times the diam divided by 2, which is just the diam. I'll tell you what, let's do this. Maybe this will make it more clear. I'm going to say this dot rad for radius is equal to this dot diam divided by 2, because the radius is half the diameter, right? Okay, so down here, I'm going to say 2 times the radius. So if d is less than this dot rad times 2, which is the same as the diameter, then that means they're overlapping. And so I'm going to say is overlapping is now equal to true. that was a variable. Remember, Boolean variables can have one of two values, either true or false. So I'm making sure I spelled this correctly. I'm going to go ahead and drop it down here. I had spelled it incorrectly, so now that works. And so the other thing I want to do is change the color. And so the color of this guy is, let's see here, let's say if they're overlapping, then I'm going to change it to, let's say, red. And so we'll drop this guy down to 20, and we'll drop this guy down to 20. And it has 255 red, which is red turned all the way up, and then green turned way, way down, and blue turned way, way down as well. Now this isn't going to quite work yet, because the first thing I have to do is when I come in here, I'm going to set these two guys to their default values. I'm only going to change them if they're overlapping. And so otherwise, we're going to assume overlapping is false, and we're going to assume that the color will be back to what it was up here, which was 100, 200, 150. So it's kind of a greenish color, I believe. And so that is going to give me everything I need. I think this is going to work. Notice I have all these curly braces. You've got to make sure your curly braces are matching, and so I'll put a little marker down here. So this is end function, and so if you just click on it, you can see this guy's connected with the for loop. This is my first if statement, and I have an if statement inside of an if statement. I'm only checking if the bubble I'm looking at is not this bubble, and if the radius. Now, this part I'll talk about in just a second, but this is saying if they're closer than 2 times the radius, they're overlapping. And I put some examples of why that's true in the slides. But let's just go ahead and see if this is working. Okay, let's go ahead and see if the function runs. So I'm just going to drag this into my browser and drop it. And it's not running. So I'll look in the debugger, and it says check overlapping is not a function. So let's go there and find out. Here's my check overlapping. Oh, it looks like I copied the variable name rather than the function name. So I need to take this name, check overlapping. That should be the name of my function. So now those two guys match. The function call and the function name have to match exactly. And I put is overlapping instead. So that was silly. So is overlapping is a variable here. It's a variable down here on line 26. Let's go ahead and see if that fixed it. If I come back over here now and reload it, oh, now it's working perfectly. So I can see that every time 2 of these bubbles overlap, they are changing color. So let's just talk briefly about why that's true. Okay, so there's 3 possibilities. I can have a circle here like this, and if I have the radius, we'll say R1 and R2. Those 2 radii, the distance between them is the distance between their center points. That distance is going to be greater than R1 plus R2, okay? But if they're overlapping, and of course mathematically there's a third possibility that they're tangent, but we won't do that. So here, R1 and here, R2, those 2 radii are going to be greater than the distance. So the distance is less than R1 plus R2. And so if this is true, then they're overlapping. And if we look back at the code, that's what I'm checking on line 25. I'm finding the distance using this dist method inside the vector constructor function. And then all I'm doing is I'm saying if the distance is less than 2 times the radius, they're overlapping. So I change my variable is overlapping to true, and I change the color. And I'm doing this inside of a for loop, so I'm checking this bubble against every other bubble in the array every frame. And that's it for today. Bye-bye.